Welcome. I'm Ivy Wu. I'm the chair of the Urban Planning Department at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. And today we are so honored to have Rick Cole joining us. And he's the executive director of the Congress for the New Urbanism. And I just want to insert it that one of our ADAC faculty years ago, Mayor Norquist, who was executive director of the Congress, the NU. So we're so grateful that Rick can give us a presentation on climate change, racial equity, and city governance. And this is the highlight of the highlights in your bio. Rick Cole is the former mayor of Pasadena, California. Rick stated to walk around and to look at the new urbanism design. Deputy mayor of Los Angeles and city manager of Santa Monica. He has unique first-hand perspective on how cities must adapt and local governments must lead. He's adjunct professor of urban policy and politics at Occidental College and former senior fellow at Laskin School of Public Affairs at UW. We're so grateful that you can join us. So let's give a hand.
Thank you, Dean Wu, and thank you for coming. Obviously, in an audience this year, I would love to see how this all unfolds. But please feel free to jump in as we talk. I'm going to just give you a sense. I've been executive director of the Congress for just over 4 months, and this is my first trip as director out to our chapter, so I spent time in Michigan, Congress chapter. And as we will talk, the Congress is 2 decades old, and we had an extraordinarily huge impact, which I'll touch on in the 90s. And like a lot of institutions, organizations, and businesses, 30 years in, the question is, so you win, did you lose, are you done, is there more? And that's what I want to focus on today. But I think for anybody who's not familiar with New Urbanism, I do want to ground the background of it. So we'll move through that part quickly because I sense a pretty educated audience here in terms of understanding what New Urbanism is and why we have it. But go ahead, Chris. So people wonder, well, what is new about new urbanism? And of course, it's grounded in the old urbanism. This is a picture you may recognize of Milwaukee. It looks just like that now, right? And from all over the world, the craftspeople and the builders and the visionaries that built the great American industrial cities, they drew on timeless principles of how to build things from all over the world. And what's remarkable is the pace of growth that they experienced and how well it came out. Chicago grew from, in 1850, the population of Chicago was 24,000. 40 years later, it was over 1 million. There has never been that kind of growth in the history of humanity. What's going with that space Elliott today? Exactly. Shenzhen in 1985 was 30,000 people. 30 years later, it was over 10 million. Right? So 10 times the pace of the growth of Chicago. But when this happened, that there was what is remarkable is that given the pace of growth, these folks did much better on city planning than the generation that followed. In 1939, and many people don't realize that Roosevelt did not get us out of the Depression. World War II got us out of the Depression. In 1939, we were still very much in the depths of the Great Depression. And General Motors spent $2.5 million on a Pavilion at the New York World's Fair. They called it Futurama. And there's a picture of the diorama of the magnificent utopia we were all going to live in, which was connected by, there's going to be skyscrapers and lots of garden suburbs and big universities, and all of that is going to be connected by free-flowing highways. And this had a remarkable impact on people, because after they got out of their little chairs, because that required a certain suspension of disbelief, right, to look at this little diorama and say, okay, that's not really reality. But then when they got out, they entered into this court at full two-story scale of Futurama with General Motors' future cars parked at the curb. So Rosie the Riveter and G.I. Joe were captivated by this vision, which was promoted in all the magazines, promoted by the business interests. And we built suburbia based upon this vision. And it was a vision that dismissed 5,000 years of learning how to build places. And because that was obsolete. We have air conditioning now. We don't have to worry about climate. We have cars. We don't have to worry about getting around. We're going to be a wealthy country, so we don't have to worry about leasing. And so we built this place, and that's where the majority of Americans live. Futurama. That left the old cities behind, and left those people who couldn't afford to move, didn't want to move, or were forbidden from moving, from going to the suburbs. And there was this catastrophic set of decisions. And I saw in Oklahoma City, I saw it downtown Grand Rapids, I saw it downtown Detroit, of scraping back swaths of neighborhoods and commercial districts. The idea is that we get rid of blight, we get rid of slums, we get rid of those people and start over again. And it was economically, socially, and environmentally as bad as bombing our own city. Except we did it with bulldozers. And 3.5 million people lost their homes, lost their businesses, were uprooted, had to find a new place to live. And the vast majority of them were poor. And the vast majority of those poor people were people of color. And they were forbidden by law, by practice, by redlining, by discrimination from living in those. So 1968, the Congress got around passing the Fair Housing Act, which then decades to be enforced. Go ahead, please. So this is the this wasn't in Futurama. This wasn't part of the diorama. But this is the reality throughout America. And by no means is that the worst picture, right? It's soul crushing in its bleakness, incredibly wasteful of land, sets us up on this cycle of having to dig for oil, pollute the environment, fight foreign wars, spend money we don't have, and call it progress. And this is when the Congress for the Urbanism arose in the early 90s to say, this is unsustainable. There's a great American economist, Herb Stein. You know the Herb Stein, the science law. His first formulation was a little abstract, so let me try it on you. Things which are unsustainable have a tendency to come to a stop. You have to think about that for a minute. So he shortened it to things that can't go on forever. And so this is not something that could go on forever, although we continue to stand it out. It still remains the dominant pattern of development in America, a kind of zombie momentum and inertia. Because banks know how to fund this, governments know how to permit this, developers know how to build this. So we keep churning it out, even though we know that it doesn't hold its value. That what you end up with 30 years later, unless you're very lucky, and in our city like Birmingham, Michigan suburbs that I visited, where you're reinvesting in yourself, you end up with places like Ferguson, Missouri, or the inner suburbs, which are now suffering the same kind of blight and disinvestment and racial segregation that once characterized inner city areas. So Congress says the environmental damage, the economic damage, the social damage, the damage to our sense of community as Americans, those are not separate things. Those are the same thing, and how we build our cities isn't the only factor in this. But it is a really important and undervalued factor in this. You can have bad social and economic outcomes in good cities. And you can overcome for a certain period of time if you have enough money and enough political will poorly designed places, like Brasilia, right? It's a poorly designed capital, but if you're a country of 180 million people, you can make it work as your capital because you will that in being. But it's much harder to make a place that's designed poorly work, and it's much easier to make a well-designed place work. So this is what we believe in new urbanism, and this is what we have fought for the last 30 years. And the remarkable thing, of course, is that now hardly anybody disagrees with it. Right? You go to planning school, you go to architecture school, you go to the Urban Land Institute, you go to the American Planning Association, you go to the American Institute of Architects, even the International Institute of Transportation Engineers. They would sort of say, yeah, I would agree with that, while they're widening freeways in Milwaukee and Los Angeles. Right? But intellectually, we won the battle. I don't know if you know this quote. It's often attributed to Gandhi, I'm sure wrongly, but that's the internet. First, they ignore you. Then they laugh at you. Then they attack you. Then you win. And that's exactly what happens in New Urbanism. First, the Harvard Design School said, oh, a fringe. Then they said, oh, they're a bunch of bow-tie fun buddies that design suburbs and put porches on them. That's silly. And then they said, oh, this is evil. Two people, you're challenging the status quo. And then they said, we don't even make you. We're for walkability. We signed up for that. Sure. Go ahead. So we changed the paradigm. We didn't always change the practice. And here's an unfortunate reality that we have to come to grips with. The public perception of new urbanism is we build really nice places that only rich people can afford. Or we support infill in neighborhoods that gentrify. There's some truth to that. Because in a society organized the way ours is, where real estate is a commodity, really nice places turn out to have a really high demand. And especially if there's a limited supply of it. I mean, Seaside was not built as a resort for rich people. Seaside was built to be a town, a real town for real people. But the rich people out of business everybody else because it was gorgeous. And so that's a reality. And most people didn't pay attention to the fact that in the 1990s, we were the spearhead of the whole state, which was taking these terribly disinvested public housing projects and turning them into big income, which is better for the poor people and better for the neighborhood. And then the funding was cut off, so it ended up we didn't make much progress beyond that. And when there's a limited number of chairs, it's not the poor people that get this happen. the reality about New Urbanism is we had great values that we espoused from the beginning about challenging the economic and social segregation, and yet oftentimes there were unintended consequences of doing places that people love. This is 06, by the way, right? That's mixed income housing in Baltimore. Go ahead. So as I said, nowadays everybody thinks this is the CASPIA, right? We're all for. They don't call it New Urbanism, they call it what it should be. It's good planning, smooth scale architecture, walkable community, smart growth. Right? Got a lot of names, but basically everybody says they believe it. Okay. So if we won the battle, should we just quit? Okay, now everybody's for it. What are we here for? Is there anything new about New Urbanism? So this is our strategic plan as an organization. But the organization is not the movement. The Congress for New Urbanism is not the movement for better, more equitable, more resilient, more socially just cities. That movement is broader. We're an important strain. Our part of that movement really focuses in on the urban design piece of it. And not everybody in our movement is an urban designer, but they believe in the power of urban design to affect transportation, to affect better social outcomes, to affect better environmental outcomes. So the movement, though, is broader. It includes people who believe in Black Lives Matter, who believe in fighting climate change, who believe in having a child be able to find green space instead of the street. That's the broader movement of humanizing our cities. And so our strategic plan is to take our piece of that. And so it's got 3 what, 3 hows, and what I call the prime directives. The 3 whats are legalize walkable urbanism, because believe it or not, it's illegal in 50 states, right? The vast majority of the 40,000 governments in America forbid you to build wide sidewalks, forbid you to build something without building a big parking lot in front of it, forbid you from having a duplex or an apartment above your garage in a single family neighborhood. And so all of the things that people say, oh, we're for walkable urbanism, but you can't do it here. So that has to be, that's a hand-to-hand down in historic cities, in new cities, and in suburbs. And designing for climate change. Climate change isn't coming. Climate change is here. We're experiencing it and its symptoms. The sea level rise, flooding, and wildfires in the west, and hurricanes in the south, tornadoes in the Midwest, and in a warming climate. The cold places are getting warmer, and the warm places are getting hotter, and not just obviously in America. So we need to not just do mitigation, we need to do adaptation. And before air conditioning, people lived in North Africa. So we're going to have to figure out how to build for the climate that is changing. And then in this strategic plan, we talk about complete neighborhoods, which emphasizes the social aspect, which is important, which is that a complete neighborhood is not a neighborhood just of poor people, or just of rich people, or just of young people, or just of old people, or just singles, or just seniors. A complete neighborhood has room for all walks of life, has room for all incomes, has room for people of different races and national backgrounds and religions and values and beliefs. But it also physically means that within 15 minutes you can walk or bike to get your daily needs. You won't be able to go to the Packers game. You won't be able to walk to the Packers game in every neighborhood. You won't be able to go to the opera in every neighborhood. But you should be able to go to the grocery store. You should be able to go to the cleaner. You should be able to get a cup of coffee without having to get into suburban coffee. And that's what a complete neighborhood is, all of that. And the mayor of Paris is talking to residents, I think, about 15 minutes before. So that captures, I think, it captures the imagination. So we utilize it. So those are the three whats. There are a lot of things that urbanists do and care about. But these are the three things we think drive the movement in the earth. So here are the three hows. How do we do that, right? That don't sound great. I want to battle climate change. I want to legalize local urbanism. I believe in fully urban. How is that ever even going to happen? We start with those 40,000 local jurisdictions. We get people on planning boards, and on city council, and influence people, and talk to the planners, and the architects, and the community. Talk to the bankers, talk to the builders, talk to the business people, talk to the bike activists, talk to the social activists, talk to the churches, and get people to change and to build momentum and to cause this movement to sweep across the country, not imposed from Washington, D.C. or necessarily from 50 state capitals, but really zoning was imposed in every city in America except Houston, right? It didn't. All those cities adopted Euclidean zoning. I remember growing up, I actually am not a planner, but I played one on television. And some of my best friends, including both of our three children, is a planner. And they would tell me about how horrible Houston was, right? Because they didn't have zoning. I go to Houston, I would see this. It's the same fucked up mess as every other city in America, right? It's just a little bit more interesting, right? They've got some things that don't necessarily belong together, keep the gel, but it's the same, wide arterial, the same stuff that you get. So Euclidean zoning is not given us some utopia. Euclidean zoning is given us a picture actually of the art. So we need to work with local government, and we need to step up education training. So what I'm doing here today, and I know I'm a little bit carrying both Newcastle, right? Most of you know all this stuff, but we need to do this not just what we should do, but how do you develop the political will? How do you actually get the bankers on board with this, so that they finance a mixed-use project? How does that even work? And then how do you evaluate what works? It's one thing to say, oh yeah, we'll do this and do this, but sometimes the retail doesn't work. Sometimes we say, well, we want ground floor activation, we want everybody to be Paris, but there isn't enough retail demand. Right? We need to continue to be new in our new urbanism. And then this is fundamental, so again, why I'm here. We need to diversify and engage our membership. We're not an organization where you spend $25 once a year and we'll pay for a token. Like they're wonderful. I belong to the Sierra Club. That's what I get to pay every year. I subscribe to their magazine. I'm all for saving the polar bears and the redwoods. But we're an organization of doers, of activists, thinkers, of people who care deeply in their heart and want to do something. And so we have 19 chapters. We have a couple of caucuses. We have Christian caucus, and I love the name. Our newest is the Black Congressional Caucus, right? Because we're the Congress for New Urbanism, so we have a congressional caucus. So we want to diversify and engage a movement of members who are making things happen. And then this is the prime directive, and this is central to who we are as Americans and as New Urbanism, which is, again, at the core of New Urbanism is a commitment to diversity, inclusion, and equity, but we didn't use those words 30 years ago. Instead, we said we oppose segregation by race and class. But as I acknowledged earlier, we haven't always lived up to it. To be fair, most of our members are white. Most of them are middle class. We've often built for the NCR audience instead of doing what we should do in inner cities as partners, in Rust Belt towns as partners, and in disaffected rural communities as partners. And I emphasize as partners, not as missionaries who come with, here, open our briefcase, do our charrette, and say, here's the solution to all your problems. But again, embedded in the original charter is that we plan with the community, not for the community. Nothing about us And so the language of our strategic plan and the prime directive is to identify and confront exclusionary policies, practices, and behaviors, to work with those most effective, and to change what is perpetuating inequity and inequality in our society. Why? Because it's right, yes, but also because the fate of the American experiment depends upon it. I would never bet against the United States of America. We've had worse times than the times we're living through now. But the way we've overcome the Great Depression, Civil War, is to find common ground. Is to pull together. It is to look for common prosperity and common wealth. And when we become deeply divided politically and economically, we falter. The problem gets worse. And democracy frays. And so new urbanism is not just nicer architecture, prettier neighborhoods, or more economically profitable real estate development. New urbanism is about reclaiming America's towns, cities, for Americans, and for the people who, for all of our hundreds of years, have come to those towns and countries and cities from all over the world, and from rural areas, for opportunity. And we need to create places that welcome them and that create that opportunity. So some of that stuff is work we've been doing really well for a long time, which is challenging single-family zoning. That's now under attack all over the country because people are now recognizing the racist origins of single-family zoning. The good part about zoning was, you don't want to live next door to a steel plant, so let's separate industrial from residential. By the way, I saw the Oscar Mayer plant. Now it's separated by a highway, not by zoning. But people are challenging single-family zoning because they've made a big step in Portland, Minneapolis, Seattle, and the whole state of California. This is single-family zoning. We've been fighting highway widening. It's extraordinary to me that we're still widening highways and we're still displacing poor communities, but it's still happening. And we got to reverse the continuing patterns of urban sprawl. But we also have to do more about affordable housing. It's not been. We've always sort of believed in naturally affordable housing of complete neighborhoods rather than just stamping out for housing tracts, but rather more houses, bigger houses, accessory units, housing both retail, duplexes, triplexes, etc. Clearly, we have to focus more on the whole question of subsidy as naturally creating affordable housing. We have to confront the issue of the G word. When people care deeply about neighborhoods and they were loyal to those neighborhoods for decades, and now as those neighborhoods are seeing new investment, people are being pushed out. And so we have to confront that. And we have to name racism because it remains a factor in why we decide to make decisions about where to invest and where not to invest. So that's the prime directive. So this is who we are. We're a new urban. We're part of this much larger network, this larger movement of people who care deeply about the fate of humanity and the fate of the planet. How we build our cities and towns and suburbs is a very important factor. Because for the first time in human history, the majority of the world's population now lives in cities. That's accelerated by the end of this century. 80% of the world's population will be crowded in the cities. And if we can't make American cities beautiful, resilient, prosperous, dynamic, can't make democracy work in our local communities, what hope is there for Jakarta? What hope is there for Lagos? What hope is there for Shenzhen? with our rule of law and our wealth and our heritage of making great places, we can't create resilient communities and climate change that can stand the economic pressures of borrowing billions of dollars in infrastructure that is falling apart. We can't do that, and it brings our future for our children and our grandchildren. So my job as executive director is to carry this message into every community. That a nice place to live and living in a vibrant community should not be something that, you know, if you go to college, go to graduate school, work hard, and are lucky, then you win the lottery. It should be the birthright of every American. Grow up in Appalachia, grow up in the Bronx, grow up in Omaha, Kansas. You should be able to walk or bike to a place to work, a place to get your groceries. You should be able to meet your neighbors, and that's the architecture of community. We want to rebuild that. We want to reclaim that heritage for America. So that's what's new about urbanism. I would love to engage you in your challenges, your questions, and your comments about what I've shared and maybe what I haven't shared. So who wants to break yet?
I just have a question in terms of the development community. Because a lot of places that those up where practicing work, the communities, like you said, agree with a lot of it. That we're not having to explain it and justify it as much. But sometimes it comes down to the developer